The Duke of Ashford had laughed before, but never quite like this. His voice echoed through the marble hall of Thornwood Manor, bouncing off gilded mirrors and crystal chandeliers, as a girl no older than 17 stood before him in mud-caked boots and a threadbare cloak. Her hair hung in tangled auburn waves, her face smudged with soot, yet her green eyes blazed with a conviction that seemed to pierce through the very air. "I am Eleanor Ashford," she declared, her voice unwavering despite the trembling of her hands, "daughter of your late brother Thomas, and by law I am your heir." The hall fell silent. Then the Duke's laughter erupted again, cruel and mocking, joined by the tittering of lords and ladies gathered for the evening's entertainment. But Eleanor did not flinch. From the folds of her tattered dress she withdrew a sealed document, its wax bearing a crest that made the Duke's laughter die in his throat. If you are listening to this story, do not forget to click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments from which part of the world you are hearing this story. I want to know how far it has traveled. Eleanor Ashford had not always known hunger. There had been a time long ago when her world consisted of warmth and laughter, of a father who lifted her onto his shoulders and pointed out the constellations through the windows of a modest country house. Thomas Ashford, younger brother to the Duke, had chosen a different path from the glittering aristocracy that defined his family's legacy. He had married for love, a woman of gentle birth but no fortune, and they had lived quietly in the rolling hills of Derbyshire, far from the political machinations of London society. But that world had shattered when Eleanor was barely 10 years old. Her mother had succumbed to fever in the harsh winter of 1842, and her father, grief-stricken and weakened, followed within the year. The creditors had descended like vultures, stripping away everything that had once been home. Eleanor remembered standing in the empty drawing room, watching strangers carry away her mother's piano, her father's books, the portrait that had hung above the fireplace, showing her family in happier times. She had written to her uncle then, the Duke of Ashford, a man she had never met but whom her father had spoken of, with a mixture of sadness and resentment. The letter had gone unanswered. A second letter, penned in her careful schoolgirl hand, had met the same silence. By the time Eleanor understood that no help was coming, she had been placed in the Whitmore Home for Destitute Children, a grim stone building on the outskirts of Manchester where the wind cut through broken windows and the porridge was more water than oats. The years that followed had been a study in survival. Eleanor learned to make herself small to avoid the notice of the crueler matrons, to protect the younger children from the worst of the cold and hunger. She had found solace in the abandoned library, a dusty room where forgotten books lined the shelves like patient friends. There, by candlelight stolen from the chapel, she had educated herself, devouring volumes on history, law, mathematics, and literature. Her father had begun her education, and she was determined to honor his memory by continuing it. Among those books, she had found something else, something that changed everything. It was a treatise on inheritance law, dry and technical, but within its pages lay a revelation. According to the laws of primogeniture and the specific entailment of the Ashford estate, in the absence of male heirs, the title and lands could pass through the male line to a daughter. Her father, as the Duke's younger brother, stood in direct succession, and Eleanor, as Thomas's only child, was legally the heir should her uncle die without sons. She had researched frantically, cross-referencing every legal text she could find in Manchester's public library during the rare hours she was allowed outside the orphanage walls. The Duke of Ashford, for all his wealth and power, had no children. His wife, the Duchess Catherine, had died in childbirth 15 years ago, taking their infant son with her. He had never remarried. The line of succession was clear, codified in documents dating back to the 17th century when the Ashford dukedom had been created. Armed with this knowledge, Eleanor had made a decision that would have seemed madness to anyone who knew the reality of her circumstances. She would go to Thornwood Manor, the Duke's principal seat in Oxfordshire, and claim her birthright. Not out of greed, not out of a desire for luxury, but because she believed with the fierce conviction that only the young and desperate possess, that it was right, that she owed it to her father's memory, to the life he had been denied by a family that had cast him out for choosing love over duty. Escaping the Whitmore home had been surprisingly easy. At 17, Eleanor was among the oldest residents, and the staff paid little attention to girls on the verge of aging out of the system. She had saved every penny earned from mending clothes for neighbouring households, hidden in a hollow bedpost. It was enough for third-class rail fare to Oxford and a single meal. She had walked the rest of the way to Thornwood through muddy country roads, sleeping in barns, arriving on the doorstep of the grand estate, looking exactly like what she was, a ragged orphan girl with an impossible claim. The servants had tried to turn her away, of course. But Eleanor had learned, in the harsh crucible of the orphanage, the power of persistence. She had returned each day for a week, standing at the servants' entrance, calmly stating her name and her purpose, until word of the peculiar beggar girl reached the Duke himself. He had been hosting a gathering, she later learned, a weekend party for prominent members of Parliament and local gentry, when he decided that the strange girl's presence might provide amusing entertainment for his guests. And so Eleanor found herself ushered into the great hall of Thornwood Manor, a space so vast and opulent it seemed to belong to another world entirely. The ceiling soared 3 stories high, adorned with frescoes depicting the heroic deeds of Ashford ancestors. Marble columns lined the walls, interspersed with towering mirrors that multiplied the light of 100 candles. The gathered aristocracy, in their evening finery of silk and velvet, turned as one to regard the muddy, threadbare figure that had been admitted into their midst. The Duke of Ashford himself sat in a great chair upon a raised dais, a man in his 50s with the sharp, handsome features that had once defined the Ashford men, now softened by dissipation and cruelty. His eyes, the same green as Eleanor's own, held no recognition, no warmth, only sardonic amusement. Beside him stood his cousin, Sterling Langley, a man whose ambitions to inherit the Ashford fortune were well known in society circles. Sterling's wife, Charlotte, a pretty woman whose calculating eyes constantly assessed the social hierarchy of any room, whispered something that made the Duke chuckle. Eleanor had walked forward, her head held high, despite the weight of every contemptuous gaze, despite the mud that flaked from her boots onto the pristine marble floor. She had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in her mind, but nothing could have prepared her for the visceral reality of it, the way her heart hammered against her ribs, the way her mouth went dry. And then she had spoken the words that would change everything. The Duke's laughter had been the first response, a sound that started as genuine mirth at what he perceived to be an absurd jest, and grew into something darker, more mocking. The assembled guests had followed his lead, as guests always did, their laughter creating a cascade of sound that seemed designed to drown Eleanor in ridicule. She stood there, acutely aware of how she must appear to them, this girl who claimed kinship with one of England's oldest dukedoms. While wearing a dress that had been mended so many times, the original fabric was barely visible. "My dear child," the Duke said when he could speak again, his voice dripping with condescension, "I commend your audacity. Thomas's daughter, you say? How convenient that you should appear now, after all these years, with such a claim." He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Thomas Ashford died without leaving any provision for his family, as I understand it. He made his choices, chose to abandon his heritage for some romantic fantasy. If he had a daughter, and I'm not saying he did, she would have been provided for through the proper channels." Eleanor felt the heat rising in her cheeks, but she kept her voice steady. "My father wrote to you, Your Grace, twice, after my mother's death, when he was dying himself. The letters went unanswered." The Duke waved a dismissive hand. "I receive hundreds of letters, begging letters mostly, from those who think a connection. however distant or imaginary, to the Ashford name entitles them to my charity. Why should I remember two among so many? It was a lie, and Eleanor knew it. Her father had described the estrangement between the brothers with painful clarity in the diary she had found among his few remaining possessions. The Duke had never forgiven Thomas for refusing an arranged marriage to a wealthy heiress, for choosing instead to marry Eleanor's mother, a vicar's daughter, whose only fortune was her goodness. The Duke had declared his brother dead to the family, had forbidden his name to be spoken at Thornwood. "I have proof of my identity," Eleanor said, reaching into her cloak. The movement caused several footmen to step forward, as if she might be drawing a weapon, but she produced only a leather portfolio, cracked with age. From it, she withdrew documents that she had carefully preserved for 7 years, moving them from hiding place to hiding place in the orphanage. Her parents' marriage certificate, properly registered in the church at Ashford Village. Her own birth certificate bearing her father's full name and title, Mr. Thomas Henry Ashford, brother to the Duke of Ashford. Letters in her father's hand, written to his daughter, speaking of his love and his regrets, mentioning details of the Ashford family that no impostor could know. And finally, the document that had given Eleanor the courage to make this journey, a copy of her grandfather's will, obtained from the solicitors in London who managed the Ashford estate. She held them out, but the Duke did not move to take them. Instead, Sterling Langley descended from the dais, his expression a careful mask of concern that did not quite reach his eyes. "Your Grace, perhaps we should examine these documents in private. The girl may be deluded, but if there is any substance to her claims—" "There is no substance," the Duke interrupted, his voice hard now, the amusement gone. "Thomas severed his connection to this family when he chose his path. Whatever children he may have produced have no claim on the Ashford legacy. Actually, Your Grace, that is not precisely accurate under law." The voice came from the back of the hall, cultured and calm. Eleanor turned to see a man step forward, older than the other guests, with silver hair and a face marked by intelligence rather than vanity. He wore the dark coat of a professional man rather than aristocratic finery. "Forgive my interruption, but I am Henry Caldwell, solicitor. The law of primogeniture and the specific terms of the Ashford entailment are quite clear. If this young woman can prove she is indeed the legitimate daughter of Thomas Ashford, she stands in direct line of succession to the dukedom in the event that Your Grace produces no male heir." The hall, which had been filled with mocking laughter moments before, fell silent. The Duke's face darkened, a flush spreading across his cheeks. "This is absurd. She is a beggar, an opportunist. Look at her." "The law does not require an heir to meet standards of dress or deportment, Your Grace," Caldwell continued. "Only standards of legitimacy and blood. If the documents she carries are authentic, they are not." Sterling Langley had taken the portfolio from Eleanor's hands before she could react, and now he held the papers up to the light of the chandelier, examining them with exaggerated skepticism. "These could be forgeries purchased for a few shillings in any London print shop. The girl is clearly a confidence trickster, probably put up to this by some enemy of Your Grace seeking to cause embarrassment." Charlotte Langley laughed, a tinkling sound designed to break the tension. "Really, this has been most entertaining, but surely we should return to our evening. Your Grace, perhaps send the girl away with a few coins so she doesn't starve on the road. It would be the charitable thing to do." Eleanor felt the moment slipping away, felt the crowd's attention already turning back to their own pleasures, dismissing her as they would dismiss any other spectacle that had briefly captured their interest. Desperation made her bold. She stepped forward, directly addressing the Duke, her voice rising to carry through the hall. "You know I speak the truth. You know because I have my father's eyes, your eyes, the Ashford eyes that look back at you from every portrait in this hall. You know because my father told me about this place, about the library where you and he used to hide as boys, about the old oak on the eastern grounds where you carved your initials. You know because when my father died, Part of you knew you were sending his daughter to poverty and despair, and you chose to let it happen. The Duke rose from his chair, his face now white with rage. How dare you come into my house and speak to me in such a manner? You claim to be an Ashford. The Ashfords are dignified, educated, bred to lead. You are nothing but a dirty, presumptuous child who does not know her place. He descended the dais, moving toward her with such menace that Eleanor instinctively stepped back. Your place is in the workhouse, the gutter, wherever the low-born belong. You will leave my house immediately, and if you ever attempt to return or to spread these lies about your supposed heritage, I will have you arrested for fraud and thrown into a prison where you can contemplate the consequences of your impudence. Eleanor's hands were shaking now, tears of humiliation pricking at her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She would not give him that satisfaction. The law. I am the law in this county, the Duke snarled. I sit in the House of Lords. I appoint magistrates. What do you think your precious legal arguments will matter when no solicitor will take your case, when no judge will hear your petition? You are alone, girl. You have nothing and no one. Sterling Langley had moved to her side, gripping her arm with a hand that appeared gentle to observers, but dug painfully into her flesh. Come along now, he said, his voice falsely kind. You've had your moment. Time to go back to wherever you came from. He steered her toward the servants' entrance, and Eleanor found herself moving through a gauntlet of contemptuous faces, hearing the whispers that followed her. Audacious little thing. Quite mad, clearly. Should be in Bedlam, not bothering her betters. The Duke's voice rose above the rest, already turning the incident into an anecdote for his guests' entertainment. You see what we must endure? Every unfortunate in England seems to think they can claim kinship with those above their station. The girl was rather convincing. I'll grant her that. Probably coached by some criminal element. But we've seen through her scheme. Eleanor was deposited outside the kitchen entrance, the door closing firmly behind her. She stood there in the darkness, the sounds of music and laughter drifting from the manor's lit windows, and for the first time since her parents' deaths, she allowed herself to cry. Not from sadness, but from rage, from the injustice of it all. She had been right. She was the legitimate heir, and it had not mattered at all. She did not know how long she stood there, but eventually she became aware of a presence nearby. An elderly woman had emerged from the shadows, dressed in the black dress and white apron of a housekeeper. Her face was lined but kind, and she carried a bundle wrapped in cloth. "Miss Eleanor," the woman said quietly, and Eleanor's head snapped up in surprise. "I am Mrs. Thorne. I was housekeeper here when your father was a boy. I remember him well. I remember the day he left, and the Duke's rage. I remember your grandmother weeping." She pressed the bundle into Eleanor's hands. "Food for your journey and a bit of money. Not much, but enough to get you somewhere safe." "You believe me," Eleanor whispered. "I believe you are exactly who you say you are," Mrs. Thorne replied. "I knew it the moment I saw you. You have your father's look about you, and your grandmother's spirit. But, child, you must understand, the Duke will never acknowledge you. He cannot. To do so would be to admit that he was wrong to cast out his brother, wrong to ignore your father's pleas for help. Men like the Duke do not admit wrong. They rewrite history instead. Then what do I do?" Mrs. Thorne's eyes were sad but resolute. "You survive, child. You go on living. And perhaps someday the truth will matter. But not today. Today you must leave this place and find another path." Eleanor clutched the bundle, feeling the weight of bread and cheese, the rustle of coins in a small purse. It was more than she had arrived with, but it felt like nothing compared to what she had hoped to gain. She nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat, and turned away from Thornwood Manor, walking back into the darkness from which she had come. Behind her, the party continued, the Duke holding court, Sterling Langley raising a toast to his cousin's forbearance in dealing with the unfortunate girl, Charlotte laughing at something a young lord had said. They had already forgotten her, dismissed her as an amusing interlude in their evening's entertainment. But Eleanor Ashford, walking the dark road toward an uncertain future, made herself a silent promise. She would survive. She would educate herself further. She would become someone who could not be dismissed or ignored. And one day, somehow, she would return to claim what was rightfully hers. The money Mrs. Thorne had given Eleanor lasted 3 weeks, during which time she made her way to London, drawn by the anonymity that only a great city could provide. She found lodging in a boarding house in Clerkenwell, a neighbourhood where the shabby genteel mixed with artisans and clerks, where no one asked too many questions as long as the rent was paid on time. The room was barely larger than a closet, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out onto a grey courtyard. But it was hers, and it was clean. Eleanor quickly realised that survival in London required more than determination. It required employment, and employment for a 17-year-old girl with no references and no connections was nearly impossible to find. She answered advertisements for governesses only to be turned away when she could not provide testimonials. She applied for positions in shops, but her obvious education made shopkeepers suspicious that she would prove unreliable, viewing their establishment as beneath her. She was growing desperate, her money dwindling, when she happened to pass a bookshop on Chancery Lane. A notice in the window advertised for an assistant, someone who could read Latin and keep accounts. Eleanor had both skills, learned during her long nights in the orphanage library, and she entered the shop with more hope than she had felt in days. The proprietor was a woman, which was unexpected. Agatha Pemberton was perhaps 60 years old, with iron-grey hair pulled back in a severe bun, spectacles perched on a sharp nose, and eyes that seemed to perceive more than Eleanor was prepared to reveal. She examined Eleanor for a long moment, taking in her worn but clean dress, her educated speech, the desperation poorly hidden behind careful composure. "You have the look of someone running from something," Miss Pemberton said, not unkindly. "Or someone who has been running and is tired of it. Which is it?" Eleanor hesitated, then chose honesty. "The second, ma'am." "Good. I have no patience for drama, but I respect resilience. Can you truly read Latin?" Eleanor recited the opening lines of Virgil's Aeneid from memory. Miss Pemberton's eyebrows rose slightly. "Well then, you're hired. The pay is modest, the hours are long, and I expect absolute honesty. If you prove yourself, there's a room above the shop that you can occupy. It's currently full of unsold inventory, but we can remedy that. Do we have an agreement?" It was the first kindness Eleanor had experienced since leaving Thornwood, and she had to blink back sudden tears. "Yes, ma'am. Thank you." The bookshop became Eleanor's world and her salvation. She worked from dawn until well after dark, dusting shelves, cataloguing new arrivals, learning the quirks of regular customers, accompanying Miss Pemberton to estate sales where entire libraries were sold off after their owners' deaths. She discovered that she had a natural aptitude for the work, an ability to remember titles and authors, to understand what a customer wanted before they fully articulated it themselves. More importantly, she discovered that Miss Pemberton's shop was not merely a bookshop. It was a gathering place for a particular type of London intellectual, men and women who questioned the established order, who wrote pamphlets about social reform, who believed that education should be available to all classes, that women should have the right to own property and control their own lives. They would gather in the back room on Tuesday evenings, drinking terrible tea that Miss Pemberton brewed too strong, debating philosophy and politics and law. At first, Eleanor merely served the tea and listened, but gradually, as the months passed and she proved her intelligence through quiet observations, she was invited to participate in the discussions. It was intoxicating, this world where ideas mattered more than titles, where her thoughts were valued regardless of her circumstances. It was at one of these gatherings that she met Dr. Elias Reed. He arrived in late autumn, introduced by one of the regular attendees as a physician recently returned from Edinburgh, where he had been studying new approaches to public health. He was perhaps 30 years old, with dark hair that persistently escaped its attempted ordering, brown eyes that held both intelligence and compassion, and a manner that was unassuming yet assured. He was also, Eleanor soon learned, the second son of a baronet, a man who had chosen medicine over managing his family's estates, much to his father's displeasure. There was something in that detail that resonated with her own experience, this idea of choosing one's path in defiance of family expectation. Their first real conversation occurred after a particularly heated debate about the poor laws. Most of the group had departed, but Elias lingered, examining the medical texts that Miss Pemberton kept in a corner section. Eleanor was shelving books nearby, trying not to obviously eavesdrop as he spoke with Miss Pemberton about his plans to open a clinic in Whitechapel to provide medical care to those who could not afford traditional physicians. The challenge is not just medical, he was saying, it's social, legal, economic. The poor are trapped in a system that grinds them down, and when they fall ill, they have nowhere to turn. The workhouses are death traps. The charity hospitals are overwhelmed. Something must change. Change requires resources, Miss Pemberton observed, and resources require convincing those who have them that the lives of the poor matter. Which brings us back to education and advocacy. If we can demonstrate that public health serves everyone's interest, that disease respects no class boundaries, perhaps we can build support for reform. He paused, noticing Eleanor for the first time. Forgive me, I don't believe we've been introduced. Miss Pemberton performed the introduction, and Eleanor saw the same analytical assessment in Elias's gaze that Miss Pemberton had shown months earlier. But where others might have seen only a shop girl, Elias seemed to perceive something more. You work here? He asked. Miss Pemberton's standards are notoriously high. You must be exceptionally capable. Eleanor felt a flush of pleasure at the compliment. I try to be useful, sir. Eleanor is being modest, Miss Pemberton interjected. She has reorganized my entire cataloguing system, introduced a lending library subscription that has increased revenue by 30% and reads legal texts for pleasure. She's wasted here, frankly, but I'm too selfish to encourage her to leave. Elias's interest sharpened. Legal texts? That's an unusual interest. Eleanor hesitated, but something about his genuine curiosity made her want to answer honestly. I believe understanding law is essential to changing unjust circumstances. The law governs so much of our lives, yet most people, particularly women and the poor, are entirely ignorant of their rights under it. A fair point. Are you interested in legal reform, specifically? I'm interested in justice, Eleanor said, then felt embarrassed by how earnest she sounded. That probably seems naive. Not at all. Naive would be thinking justice happens automatically. Recognizing that it must be fought for is wisdom. He smiled, a warm expression that transformed his serious face. I would very much like to continue this conversation if you're willing. Perhaps you would consent to visit my clinic once it's established. I could use someone with your organizational skills, and I think you might find the work meaningful. It was an offer that held layers of possibility, professional and perhaps personal, and Eleanor found herself accepting before she fully considered the implications. Over the following weeks, as winter settled over London and the days grew short and cold, Elias became a regular presence in her life. He would stop by the bookshop, ostensibly to purchase medical journals, but he always lingered to talk with Eleanor about his progress establishing the clinic, about patients he had seen, about his observations of London's social structures. Eleanor found herself looking forward to these visits with an intensity that surprised her. Elias treated her as an intellectual equal, asked her opinion on matters of substance, listened when she spoke about the legal barriers that prevented women from pursuing education or protecting their own interests. He never asked about her past, never pressed for details about her circumstances, accepting her as she presented herself. It was Miss Pemberton who finally addressed what was becoming obvious to everyone. She found Eleanor one evening after closing, staring out the window at the gas-lit street, a smile playing at her lips as she thought about something Elias had said earlier. "That young man is falling in love with you," Miss Pemberton said without preamble. "The question is whether you're prepared for what that might mean." Eleanor turned, startled. "I don't know what you mean." "Don't be coy. It doesn't suit you. Dr. Reed is a good man, perhaps the best I've encountered. But he's also from a world that would not readily accept a woman with no family, no connections, no past that she's willing to explain. If you encourage his interest, you must be prepared to trust him with the truth." Eleanor felt her chest tighten. She had not spoken of Thornwood Manor, of the Duke's rejection, of who she really was, to anyone in London. It was too painful, too humiliating, too dangerous. If the Duke learned she was claiming her identity, he might make good on his threat to have her arrested. "I can't tell him," she whispered. "He would think me delusional or a fraud, just as everyone at Thornwood did." Miss Pemberton's expression softened. "My dear child, I knew who you were the moment you walked through my door. Did you think I don't read the newspapers, don't hear the gossip about the Duke of Ashford and the strange girl who claimed to be his niece? Half of London was talking about it for weeks." Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. "You knew?" "I knew, and I hired you anyway, because I could see you were intelligent and desperate and honest. But if you're going to build a life here, if you're going to allow yourself to care for someone like Dr. Reed, you cannot do so under false pretenses. He deserves the truth, and you deserve someone who will believe you." That night, Eleanor lay awake in her room above the bookshop, staring at the ceiling, turning Miss Pemberton's words over in her mind. She had spent 6 months building this new life, creating a version of herself that was defined by her actions rather than her birth. The thought of revealing her past, of watching Elias's respect turn to pity or disbelief, was almost unbearable. But Miss Pemberton was right. If there was to be anything real between them, it had to be built on truth. Her opportunity came sooner than expected. Elias invited her to tour his clinic, which had finally opened in a renovated building near the London hospital. Eleanor arrived on a clear winter morning, nervous but determined. The clinic was modest, but spotlessly clean, with a waiting area already filled with patients, women with sick children, elderly men with chronic coughs, workers injured on the job who could not afford to miss work for treatment. Elias showed her around with obvious pride, explaining his vision of medicine that was accessible and compassionate, that treated the whole person rather than just symptoms. Eleanor found herself drawn into the work immediately, helping to organize patient records, speaking with those waiting in her calm, educated manner that seemed to reassure them. They worked together until evening, when the last patient had been seen and the clinic fell quiet. Elias invited Eleanor to share a simple meal in the small office he maintained upstairs, and as they sat across from each other, eating bread and cheese and drinking wine that was better than anything Eleanor had tasted in years, she felt the weight of the decision before her. "There's something I need to tell you," she began, her voice unsteady, "about who I am and where I come from." Elias set down his glass, his expression serious but open. "I'm listening." And so Eleanor told him. Everything. Her childhood with her parents, their deaths, the orphanage, her research into the Ashford inheritance, her disastrous appearance at Thornwood Manor, the Duke's cruel rejection. She watched his face as she spoke, searching for signs of disbelief or derision, but found only thoughtful attention and growing indignation on her behalf. When she finished, silence filled the small room. Then Elias reached across the table and took her hand, a gesture that was both supportive and intimate. "Eleanor, do you understand what you're saying? If your claims are legitimate, and I have no reason to doubt they are, you have been denied your legal birthright through intimidation and abuse of power." "But I have no way to prove it," Eleanor said, her voice breaking. "The Duke has influence, resources, the support of society. I have nothing." "You have the truth," Elias said firmly, "and you have me, if you'll accept my help. I may not be the Duke of Ashford, but I am the son of a baronet. I have connections in London legal circles, and I am not without resources of my own. We can find solicitors who will take your case, who will examine the documents you have, who will investigate the legitimacy of your claims." Eleanor felt tears sliding down her cheeks. "Why would you do this? You barely know me." Elias's thumb brushed across her knuckles, a gentle touch that sent warmth through her entire being. "Because what was done to you was unjust, because you deserve better than to hide and survive, and because, Eleanor Ashford, in the 6 months since I met you, I have come to admire your intelligence, your strength, and your spirit more than anyone I have ever known. I cannot stand by and watch you suffer when I have the means to help." It was not quite a declaration of love, not yet, but it was close enough to make Eleanor's heart race. It could take years. It could cost you your family's support, your reputation. The Duke will fight this with everything he has. "Then we'll fight back," Elias said simply. "Together." And sitting in that small office above a clinic in one of London's poorest neighbourhoods, holding the hand of a man who believed in her, Eleanor felt something she had not felt since her parents' deaths. She felt hope. The legal battle that followed was indeed long and arduous, consuming nearly 2 years of Eleanor's life. Elias proved true to his word, introducing her to his solicitor, a brilliant young man named James Hartley, who specialized in inheritance disputes and who found Eleanor's case both challenging and compelling. Together, they painstakingly built their argument, gathering evidence, tracking down witnesses, obtaining certified copies of documents from parish records and the Office of Arms. The Duke of Ashford, predictably, responded with fury and formidable legal resources. He claimed the documents were forgeries, that Eleanor was a confidence artist, that even if she were Thomas Ashford's daughter, her father's decision to leave the family meant he had forfeited any claim to the succession. His solicitors filed motion after motion to have the case dismissed, to prevent it from reaching court, to bury Eleanor under procedural obstacles. But Eleanor had something the Duke did not expect. She had allies. Miss Pemberton quietly spread word through London's intellectual circles, and Eleanor's story became a cause célèbre among those who believed in legal reform and social justice. Newspaper editorials debated the case, questioning whether aristocratic privilege should trump legal right, whether a young woman could be denied her inheritance simply because her father had married for love. More importantly, Eleanor had become someone who could not be dismissed. She continued working at the bookshop and at Elias's clinic, where she had become indispensable, managing the administrative side of the practice and earning the respect of patients and fellow physicians alike. She had published several pamphlets under a pseudonym, arguing for women's property rights and legal reform. She had educated herself to a degree that would have been impressive for any gentleman, let alone a woman of her circumstances, and she had Elias, whose support never wavered. Their relationship had deepened slowly, carefully, built on mutual respect and shared purpose. He had not formally proposed, not while the legal case remained unresolved, but there was an understanding between them, an assumption of a shared future that needed no official declaration. The turning point came in the spring of Eleanor's 20th year. The Duke, perhaps sensing that public opinion was turning against him, perhaps simply tired of the ongoing embarrassment, agreed to a private mediation. The setting was a solicitor's office in Lincoln's Inn, a neutral ground where both parties, their legal representatives, and an independent mediator could meet. Eleanor had not seen the Duke since that terrible night at Thornwood Manor, and she felt her hands trembling as she entered the meeting room. But she was no longer the ragged, desperate girl he had humiliated. She wore a well-made dress of dark blue wool, her hair arranged in a sophisticated style, her bearing confident. Elias stood beside her, a steadying presence, his hand occasionally brushing her arm in silent support. The Duke looked older, she noted, more worn. Sterling Langley was with him, of course, his expression coldly hostile. The mediator, A distinguished barrister named Sir Edward Blackwell outlined the purpose of the meeting, to determine whether a settlement could be reached without the expense and publicity of a trial. "Miss Ashford," Sir Edward began, "or should I say, Miss Eleanor Ashford, your legal team has presented compelling evidence of your identity and your claim to be the legitimate daughter of Thomas Ashford, deceased brother to the Duke. However, His Grace maintains that certain aspects of your claim are questionable. Perhaps we could begin by addressing these concerns directly." What followed was hours of detailed discussion, reviewing birth certificates and parish records, examining testimony from witnesses who had known Eleanor's parents, debating the finer points of inheritance law. The Duke's solicitors fought every point, but Eleanor could see they were losing ground. The evidence was simply too strong, too well documented. It was late afternoon when the Duke himself finally spoke, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "What do you want? Money? I can provide a settlement, enough to ensure you live comfortably. You can go abroad, start a new life where no one knows this unfortunate history. Surely that would be preferable to dragging this family through the courts, to airing private matters in public." Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "I want what is legally mine, Your Grace. I want recognition of my identity as Eleanor Ashford, daughter of Thomas Ashford and legitimate member of the Ashford family. I want my place in the line of succession acknowledged." Sterling Langley leaned forward, his face flushed. "You're trying to take the dukedom from His Grace. That's what this is really about. You're greedy and grasping, and you're using the law as a weapon." "I'm using the law as it was written," Eleanor replied calmly. "The Duke has no sons, no legitimate heirs. When he dies, the title will pass to the next in line, which is legally me, through my father. I'm not taking anything. I'm claiming what has always been mine by birth. Never." The Duke's voice was cold and final. "I would see the title escheat to the crown before I allowed you to inherit. I will remarry if I must, produce an heir, anything to prevent you from claiming Thornwood." Sir Edward intervened, his tone diplomatic but firm. "Your Grace, with respect, you are 62 years old. The likelihood of producing a legitimate heir at this stage is, statistically speaking, quite low, and the law is clear. If Miss Eleanor's identity is confirmed, which the evidence strongly suggests it will be, her claim is legitimate. A court will recognize it. The only question is whether you wish that recognition to occur in a public trial or in a private settlement." The room fell silent. Eleanor could see the calculation in the Duke's eyes, the weighing of options, the grudging realization that he was cornered. Sterling Langley whispered urgently in his ear, but the Duke shook him off impatiently. "What exactly are you proposing?" he asked finally, directing the question to Eleanor rather than the solicitors. Eleanor had prepared for this moment. "I propose a formal acknowledgement of my identity and place in the succession, documented and legally binding. In exchange, I will not seek any financial settlement beyond what would normally be provided to a family member of my position. I will not reside at Thornwood during your lifetime unless invited. I will not interfere in your affairs or claim any authority over the estate. I simply want the recognition that I am who I say I am." "And when I die?" the Duke demanded. "You expect to waltz in and claim everything? When you die, Your Grace, if you have produced no legitimate heir, the title will pass to me according to law. And yes, I will claim it. Not because I desire wealth or power, but because it is right. Because my father was denied his place in this family, and I will not allow his memory to be erased." Elias spoke for the first time, his voice respectful but firm. "Your Grace, Miss Eleanor is offering you a dignified resolution to this matter. She could push for immediate financial support, could make this far more difficult and embarrassing for you. She's showing remarkable restraint." The Duke's laugh was bitter. "Restraint? She's trying to steal my legacy." "With respect, Your Grace," Sir Edward interjected, "the legacy belongs to the Ashford line, not to you personally. Miss Eleanor is of that line. The law supports her claim. I strongly advise accepting this settlement." The negotiations continued into the evening, with points argued and counter-argued, with tempers flaring and cooling. But gradually, reluctantly, the Duke yielded ground. By the time they adjourned, an agreement had been reached in principle. Eleanor's identity would be formally acknowledged, her place in the succession documented, in exchange for her promise not to interfere during the Duke's lifetime. The details would be drawn up by the solicitors and signed within the fortnight. As they emerged into the twilight of Lincoln's Inn, Eleanor felt almost light-headed with relief and exhaustion. Elias wrapped an arm around her shoulders, steadying her. "You did it," he said softly. "You actually did it." "We did it," Eleanor corrected. "I could never have managed this alone." They walked slowly toward the street, where a cab waited to take them back to Whitechapel. Eleanor was acutely aware that while she had won a legal victory, she had not won the Duke's acceptance or affection. He would never see her as family, never welcome her to Thornwood, except as a legal necessity. But perhaps that was acceptable. She had never sought his love, only recognition of the truth. "Eleanor," Elias said as they reached the cab, "there's something I've been wanting to ask you, but the timing never seemed right. Now that this is resolved, or nearly so, I wonder if you would consider—" He paused, suddenly seeming uncharacteristically nervous. "Would you consent to become my wife?" Eleanor turned to face him fully, seeing in his expression everything she had come to value, his kindness, his integrity, his unwavering support. "Are you certain?" she asked quietly. "I come with considerable complications. I'll eventually be a duchess, which is hardly the sort of wife a physician typically takes." Elias smiled. "I'm not a typical physician, and you're not a typical duchess. I think we'll manage rather well together. Besides, someone will need to keep you from terrifying the House of Lords when you inevitably start advocating for women's suffrage and healthcare reform." Eleanor laughed, the sound bright with joy and relief. "Yes," she said, "yes, I will marry you." They sealed the engagement with a kiss that was both promise and celebration, standing on the steps of Lincoln's Inn as London's gaslights flickered to life around them. Eleanor knew that challenges remained, that the Duke would likely make her life difficult in subtle ways, that society might never fully accept her. But standing there with Elias, she felt ready to face whatever came next. She had reclaimed her name, her place, her future. And that, she realized, was more than enough. The formal signing of the settlement agreement took place 3 weeks later, in the same solicitor's office where the negotiations had occurred. The Duke attended with visible reluctance, his signature on the document swift and angry, as if the very act of acknowledgement caused him physical pain. Sterling Langley watched the proceedings with barely concealed fury, his ambitions to inherit the Ashford fortune definitively thwarted. Charlotte Langley, for her part, was not present, having apparently decided that association with the family's humiliation was beneath her dignity. The legal documents were precise and comprehensive. They established Eleanor's identity beyond dispute, acknowledged her as the legitimate daughter of Thomas Ashford and rightful heir in the line of succession, and outlined the terms of the arrangement that would govern the relationship between Eleanor and the Duke during his lifetime. Eleanor would receive a modest annual income appropriate to her station as a member of the Ashford family, sufficient to maintain a respectable household, but not so generous as to suggest the Duke's approval. In return, she agreed not to reside at Thornwood or claim any management authority over the estate while the Duke lived. When it was done, when the last signature had been witnessed and notarized, the Duke rose without a word and left the office, Sterling Langley, following like a resentful shadow. Eleanor watched them go, feeling not triumph, but a complicated mixture of relief and sadness. She had won her legal battle, but she had not gained a family. The recognition she had fought for was empty of affection or acceptance, a matter of law rather than love. "Are you well?" Elias asked quietly, taking her hand. Eleanor nodded. I'm exactly as I expected to be, vindicated, but still alone as far as the Ashfords are concerned. Not alone, Elias corrected gently. You have me, you have Miss Pemberton, you have all the friends you've made in London, and soon you'll have a different kind of family, ours. They had set their wedding date for midsummer, choosing a small ceremony at the church near Elias's clinic rather than the grand society affair that Eleanor's newly acknowledged status might have warranted. Neither of them wanted spectacle. They wanted something genuine, surrounded by people who truly cared for them, rather than those merely observing social obligation. The announcement of their engagement, published in the Times, alongside the notice of Eleanor's legal recognition, caused considerable stir in London society. A future duchess marrying a physician was unusual enough, but one who had fought her way through the courts to claim her birthright added a layer of scandal that made Eleanor a figure of intense curiosity. Invitations arrived from hostesses eager to meet her, to assess this unusual young woman who had defeated a duke in legal combat. Miss Pemberton advised her to accept at least some of these invitations. You'll be a duchess someday, she pointed out practically. You'll need to understand society's workings, even if you intend to reform them. Better to enter on your own terms now than to be overwhelmed later. So Eleanor began attending dinners and teas, accompanied by Elias or Miss Pemberton, navigating the complex rules of aristocratic social interaction with a combination of natural intelligence and studied observation. She discovered that her story had made her both celebrated and controversial. Reform-minded individuals saw her as a symbol of justice and legal equality, while traditionalists viewed her as an upstart who had forced her way into a world where she did not belong. It was at one such gathering, a garden party hosted by a Liberal Member of Parliament, that Eleanor encountered Charlotte Langley again. Charlotte was there with a new escort, having apparently decided that Sterling's diminished prospects made him a less attractive investment of her attentions. She approached Eleanor with a smile that was all social grace and no warmth. "Miss Ashford," she said, the emphasis on the name making it clear she would never acknowledge Eleanor as family. "How remarkable to see you in such different circumstances. You've certainly come up in the world." Eleanor met her gaze steadily. "I haven't come up, Mrs. Langley. I simply claimed the position that was always mine by birth. There's a distinction." Charlotte's smile tightened. "Of course. Though one wonders whether the Duke will find some way to disinherit you yet. These legal agreements can be so fragile when challenged by determined solicitors." "The law is not fragile," Eleanor replied calmly. "The agreement is binding and was reviewed by multiple courts. But I appreciate your concern for my welfare." The sarcasm was delicate but unmistakable. Charlotte's face flushed slightly, and she excused herself with stiff courtesy. Elias, who had witnessed the exchange from a few feet away, joined Eleanor with an amused expression. "You're learning to navigate these social waters rather well," he observed. "I'm learning that much of society is performance," Eleanor replied. "Everyone playing roles, saying what's expected rather than what's true. I find it exhausting. Then we'll limit our participation to what's necessary and spend the rest of our time doing work that matters." Speaking of which, I have news. The board of the London Hospital has agreed to fund an expansion of the clinic, including a teaching program. We'll be training other physicians in our approach to community medicine. Eleanor felt a surge of genuine excitement. "Elias, that's wonderful. It's exactly what you've been working toward." "What we've been working toward," he corrected. "You've been instrumental in building the clinic's reputation and demonstrating its effectiveness. Which brings me to a question. After we marry, what do you envision for yourself? I know you want to continue advocacy work, but have you thought about what form that might take?" It was a question Eleanor had been contemplating deeply. Her newfound status gave her a platform, a voice that could reach into places previously closed to her. "I want to work on legal reform," she said slowly. specifically around women's rights to education, property, and self-determination. I want to use my position to advocate for those who don't have the resources or the access to fight for themselves." Elias nodded, unsurprised. "You'll be brilliant at it, and I'll support you in whatever way I can." Their wedding, when it came, was everything they had hoped for, intimate and meaningful. The small church was filled with people who genuinely cared for them. Miss Pemberton and her circle of reformers, physicians and nurses from the clinic, former patients whose lives had been touched by Elias's care. Mrs. Thorne, the housekeeper from Thornwood, who had shown Eleanor kindness on the night of her humiliation, travelled to London for the ceremony, bringing news that the Duke had fallen ill with a fever, but was recovering. The Duke himself did not attend, of course, nor did he send any acknowledgement of the wedding. Eleanor found she did not mind. She had not expected his blessing, and she refused to allow his absence to diminish her joy. As she stood beside Elias, speaking vows that promised partnership and respect as much as love, she felt that she was finally, truly choosing her own path. Their wedding breakfast was held in the garden behind the bookshop, under a canopy of late roses and with champagne that Miss Pemberton had insisted on providing. Toasts were made, celebrating not just the couple, but the principles they represented: justice, compassion, the courage to challenge injustice. Eleanor, looking around at the faces of those who had supported her journey, felt a profound sense of gratitude and belonging. Later, as she and Elias prepared to depart for a brief honeymoon in the Lake District, Miss Pemberton pulled Eleanor aside. "You know the Duke will not live forever," she said quietly. "Have you prepared yourself for what will come after?" Eleanor had thought about it, of course. "When the time comes, I'll do what must be done. I'll claim the title, I'll manage the estates, and I'll use the position to do good. I'll be the Duchess my father would have wanted me to be, not the one the Duke would have chosen." Miss Pemberton smiled. "Good. The House of Lords could use someone like you shaking things up. Just promise me you won't become so grand that you forget your friends." "Never," Eleanor said firmly, embracing the woman who had been more of a mentor and mother figure than anyone since her parents' deaths. "Everything I am, everything I've become, is because people like you chose to believe in me when others would not. I'll never forget that." As their carriage rolled north out of London, toward mountains and lakes, and a brief respite from the complexities of their lives, Eleanor leaned against Elias's shoulder and allowed herself to simply feel happy. The future remained uncertain in many ways. The Duke's health, while improved, was fragile. Thornwood Manor awaited her someday, with all its complicated history and demands. Society would continue to judge and gossip and speculate about the unusual Duchess who had fought her way to her title. But she faced that future with Elias beside her, with purpose driving her, with the knowledge that she had already overcome the worst that could be thrown at her. She had survived poverty, humiliation, rejection. She had rebuilt herself from nothing into someone who could not be ignored or dismissed. Whatever came next, she was ready. 3 years after Eleanor's wedding to Elias, the Duke of Ashford died in his sleep at Thornwood Manor, aged 65. The end came quietly, without drama, a fitting conclusion to a life that had been defined by rigid adherence to tradition and a refusal to adapt to changing times. Sterling Langley, who had remained close to the Duke in hopes that some 11th-hour reprieve might restore his prospects, was reportedly present when the death occurred, along with a handful of elderly servants who had served the family for decades. The news reached Eleanor in London, where she and Elias had settled into a comfortable house near Regent's Park, close enough to the clinic to allow Elias easy access to his work, but grand enough to accommodate Eleanor's growing role as a public advocate for social reform. She received the telegram while reviewing correspondence related to a petition she was organizing, calling for the expansion of educational opportunities for working-class girls. She read the brief message twice, feeling an unexpected complexity of emotions: relief that the waiting was over, Sadness for the waste of what might have been a reconciliation, but never was. Apprehension about what lay ahead. The Duke had refused to see her even once after the legal settlement, had maintained his cold distance until the very end. Whatever resolution Eleanor had hoped for between them would now never come. "Are you all right?" Elias asked, reading her expression. "I'm not certain," Eleanor answered honestly. "He was family, even if he never acknowledged it. And now everything changes." The funeral was held at Thornwood, a grand affair befitting a duke, attended by members of Parliament, aristocracy, and local gentry. Eleanor and Elias travelled to Oxfordshire, arriving at the estate that Eleanor had seen only once before, on that terrible night when she had been a ragged girl with an impossible claim. Now she returned as the Duchess of Ashford, a title that had passed to her automatically upon the Duke's death, confirmed by the legal settlement and acknowledged by the College of Arms. The atmosphere at Thornwood was tense. Sterling Langley moved through the crowds with barely suppressed rage, his face a mask of grief that fooled no one. Charlotte, who had in fact not left him despite Eleanor's expectations, played the role of bereaved cousin with theatrical perfection. The other guests regarded Eleanor with a mixture of curiosity and uncertainty, unsure how to treat this unusual duchess who had fought her way to her title rather than inheriting it through traditional means. Mrs. Thorne, now quite elderly but still serving as housekeeper, greeted Eleanor with tears of joy. "Your father would be so proud," she whispered, "to see you here, to see you recognized as you should have been all along." The funeral service was traditional and lengthy, full of platitudes about the Duke's service and character that Eleanor found somewhat divorced from the reality of the man she had known. But she listened respectfully, aware that her every action was being observed and judged. When it came time for the burial in the family crypt, she laid flowers on her father's memorial plaque, as well as on the Duke's tomb, a deliberate gesture that several guests noted with approval. The reading of the will occurred the following day in Thornwood's library, a room Eleanor had never seen, but which lived up to her father's descriptions. Walls of books stretching to a vaulted ceiling, comfortable chairs arranged near a massive fireplace. The Duke's solicitor, an elderly man named Mr. Weatherby, presided over the proceedings with solemn efficiency. The will itself contained few surprises. The Duke had left generous bequests to long-time servants and made provisions for several charities he had supported. To Sterling Langley, he had left a relatively modest sum and a minor property in Yorkshire, a clear indication of disappointment in his cousin's character or judgment. To Eleanor, he had left nothing personal, no heirlooms, no letters, no gesture of reconciliation. It was as if, even in death, he refused to fully acknowledge her as family. But Eleanor had not expected anything different, and she refused to let the omission wound her. The title and estates were hers by law, not by the Duke's grace, and that was enough. What did surprise her was a sealed letter that Mr. Weatherby produced after the will had been read, addressed to Eleanor in the Duke's own hand. "His Grace instructed me to give this to you after the formal reading," the solicitor explained. "I have no knowledge of its contents." Eleanor took the letter with trembling fingers, aware that everyone in the room was watching. She broke the seal and read the contents silently, her expression carefully neutral, even as her heart raced. The letter was brief, written in the spidery hand of an ill man. "Eleanor, you have won. I cannot deny that, though it galls me to admit it. You were correct about the law, and I was wrong to dismiss your claim so cruelly. I tell myself I acted to protect the family's dignity, but in truth I acted from pride and from grief. Your father's choice to leave, to reject everything our family stood for, wounded me more deeply than I could acknowledge. When you appeared, claiming his name and his rights, you forced me to confront that wound, and I responded with cruelty rather than justice. I will not apologize. I'm too old and too proud for that. But I will say this. You are my brother's daughter, and you have proven yourself worthy of the Ashford name in ways I did not expect. What you choose to do with Thornwood, with the title, with the responsibilities now yours, will define whether your victory was meaningful or merely legal. My hope, though I barely admit it even to myself, is that you will be a better duke than I was. Charles Ashford. Eleanor read the letter twice, then carefully folded it and placed it in her pocket. It was not quite an apology, not quite an acceptance, but it was an acknowledgement, and perhaps that was the most the Duke had been capable of. She looked up to find Elias watching her with concern, and she gave him a small nod to indicate she was all right. Sterling Langley, unable to contain his curiosity, demanded, "What did it say?" Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "It was a private communication between the Duke and myself. The contents are not your concern." Sterling's face flushed with anger, but there was nothing he could do. Eleanor was the Duchess now, and he had no authority to question her. He gathered his few possessions and left Thornwood that very afternoon, Charlotte beside him, both of them bitter and diminished. In the months that followed, Eleanor threw herself into the work of understanding and managing the Ashford estates. She had much to learn, from agricultural management to investment strategies to the complex web of relationships that connected the dukedom to local communities and political structures. She hired new stewards, reformed tenancy practices to be more favorable to farmers, invested in improvements that would benefit the estate's long-term productivity rather than short-term profit. She also maintained her advocacy work, using her position as a duchess to gain access to parliamentary committees and influential decision-makers. She became known as a forceful advocate for education reform, women's rights, and public health initiatives. Her speeches in support of these causes, delivered in the House of Lords galleries where women were permitted to observe if not to participate, became famous for their logic and passion. Elias continued his medical practice, now expanded to include training programs and research initiatives funded in part by Eleanor's careful management of the Ashford fortune. Together, they created a partnership that balanced aristocratic duty with progressive values, traditional responsibilities with modern reforms. 5 years after becoming Duchess, Eleanor stood in Thornwood's portrait gallery, examining the paintings of Ashford ancestors that lined the walls. Her own portrait had recently been completed and hung, showing her not in traditional aristocratic finery, but in a simple but elegant dress, standing before a bookshelf, holding a legal text. It was a portrait that declared her identity and her values, and it had scandalized some of the more traditional elements of society. Elias found her there, their young daughter balanced on his hip. Little Catherine, named for Elias's mother and for the quiet strength Eleanor had learned to cultivate, reached chubby hands toward the portraits, babbling commentary in the incomprehensible language of 18-month-olds. "Thinking about the past?" Elias asked. Eleanor smiled, taking her daughter into her arms. "Thinking about how far we've come. When I stood in this house 10 years ago, I was desperate and alone, trying to convince people of a truth they didn't want to hear. Now I'm here, I belong here, and I'm using this position to help others who are desperate and alone." "Your father would be proud," Elias said softly. "I hope so. I hope he knows that his choice to marry for love rather than duty, his choice to be true to himself, ultimately mattered, that it led to this." She gestured to encompass not just the grand house but everything it represented, the reforms implemented, the lives touched, the changes made. A servant entered to announce that guests had arrived for tea. Reformers and politicians gathered to discuss the next phase of their education bill. Eleanor handed Catherine back to Elias and straightened her shoulders, preparing to return to the work that gave her purpose. Before leaving the portrait gallery, she paused once more before her father's painting, a young man in this image, full of hope and idealism. "I kept my promise," she said quietly. "I didn't let them erase you. I made sure your daughter became someone who mattered." Then she turned and walked away toward the drawing room, where important work awaited, toward a future she was actively creating rather than passively inheriting. She had bloomed, not just where she was planted, but where she had chosen to plant herself, transforming a birthright claimed through struggle into a platform for meaningful change. The Duke of Ashford had laughed when a ragged orphan girl claimed to be his heir, but Eleanor Ashford, Duchess in her own right, had the last word. She had proven that justice, persistence, and courage could triumph over privilege, prejudice, and power. And in doing so, she had not just claimed a title, she had redefined what it meant to wear it. The hall that had once echoed with mocking laughter now rang with voices debating reform, with children's laughter as Catherine played, with the sound of real, meaningful change. And that, Eleanor reflected as she greeted her guests and prepared to continue her work, was a victory worth far more than any title or fortune. She had not just won her birthright, she had earned the right to use it for good. And she intended to spend every remaining day of her life making sure that her improbable journey from orphanage to dukedom meant something beyond her own story, that it opened doors for others, that it proved the law could serve justice rather than merely preserve privilege. Eleanor Ashford had silenced the hall with her claim. Now she filled it with purpose, and that made all the difference. If you are listening to this story, do not forget to click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments from which part of the world you are hearing this story. I want to know how far it has traveled.